I posted this story on Reddit about a year after it happened because I needed somewhere to put it, somewhere to set it down and let other people look at it and confirm that what I had experienced was as absurd as it felt. Because when you are inside a situation that escalates the way this one escalated, you start to lose the ability to calibrate it. You start to wonder if you are the unreasonable one. You start to think that maybe you are missing something, some piece of context that would explain why a grown adult woman who owns a golf cart believes she has the right to drive it through your garden, through your yard, across your property without your permission, and why she responds to your objection not with embarrassment, but with outrage, genuine, sustained, organized outrage, as though you are the one who has done something wrong. The Reddit thread got more comments than I expected. Most of them were some version of the same thing, which was that no, I was not missing something, and no, I was not the unreasonable one, and yes, what had happened was as absurd as it felt, and the people commenting had seen versions of it before. Not the golf cart specifically, that was its own particular flavor of entitled, but the underlying structure of it. The neighbor who decides, without asking, that your property is an extension of their convenience, and who responds to any interference with that convenience as though the interference is the injustice rather than the original trespass. That structure, apparently, is recognizable to a lot of people. This is that story. My name, for the purposes of this account, is Nathan. I am 41 years old. I live in a semi-rural community called Whispering Pines Estates, which is one of those developments that was built about 25 years ago on the edge of a small city, with the idea of giving people the feeling of rural space while remaining close enough to urban amenities to be practical. The lots are large, mine is just under 2 acres, and the houses are set back from the roads and from each other in a way that creates the impression of significant privacy, even though, in terms of actual distance between houses, you are not as far from your neighbors as the feeling suggests. The community is not governed by a formal HOA. There is a neighborhood association that organizes social events and occasionally addresses community-wide issues, but it has no enforcement authority and no dues structure and no real power beyond the social. I have lived at my property for 7 years. In those 7 years, I have put a significant portion of my discretionary time and money into the garden. Not the lawn, the garden. Specifically, the large cultivated garden space on the eastern side of my property, which I have developed over the 6 years from a section of neglected field into something that is, by any reasonable standard, genuinely impressive. It covers approximately 3/4 of an acre and contains a kitchen garden, a cutting garden, a perennial border that I have been developing and refining for 4 years, a small orchard of 8 fruit trees at various stages of maturity, a composting system, 2 cold frames, and a network of paths that I laid myself from salvaged brick and that connect the different sections of the garden. I spend most of my weekends in it. It is the best thing about living where I live. My neighbor to the east is a woman I am going to call Diane, because that is close enough to her actual name, and because she is real and I do not want to be unnecessarily specific. Diane is in her early 60s, retired, and has lived in her house for about 15 years, making her one of the longer-established residents of Whispering Pines Estates. She is fit and active and deeply interested in the community's social life, which is to say she knows everyone and has opinions about most things. She is not a bad person. I want to say this clearly and mean it, because the story that follows involves her doing things that were wrong, and I do not want the wrongness of those specific things to stand in for a complete assessment of who she is. She is a complicated person who did wrong things and who, eventually, understood that she had done wrong things, and the understanding came at a cost that I think was sufficient. Diane has a golf cart. I want to spend a moment on the golf cart because it matters and because the golf cart is the specific object around which this entire situation organized itself. It is a late-model 6-passenger electric cart, the kind that looks more like a small utility vehicle than the traditional golf cart, with a cargo bed in the back, a windshield, and a roof. It is white, and Diane maintains it with the same care that certain people maintain their cars. It is always clean, always charged, always in apparent good working order. She uses it to move around the community, which is perfectly legal on the private roads of Whispering Pines Estates, and she uses it to carry things between her property and the community's shared spaces, which is practical and sensible. The golf cart, in itself, is fine. What the golf cart was not, and had never been, was mine to accommodate. The problem started in a way that I did not initially recognize as a problem, because the initial version of it was so casual and so low-key that it registered as an odd thing rather than a concerning thing. About 3 years after I moved in, when my garden was already substantial, but before the perennial border was established, and when the orchard trees were still young, I came home one afternoon to find tire tracks running through the eastern edge of my kitchen garden. Not through the beds, through the path between the beds, but the path between the beds was a narrow salvaged brick path not designed for anything wider than a wheelbarrow, and whatever had made the tracks had been wider than a wheelbarrow and had pressed the brick path down into the soil on either side, leaving a clear mark. I looked at the tracks. I looked at where they entered my property from the east, a section of the low field fence that divided my property from Diane's, which had a gate that I kept unlocked at that point. I looked at where they exited to the west, across the mown grass area on that side of the garden, and then curved north toward the shared road that ran along the north boundary of the properties in that section of the community. The tracks were from a golf cart. The width, the tire pattern, the turning radius, I had seen enough golf carts to recognize the trace. Something with golf cart-sized tires had entered my property through the gate on the east side, crossed a section of my garden, and exited to the north. I asked Diane about it the next time I saw her, which was 2 days later at the community mailbox cluster. I said I had noticed tire tracks through my garden and wondered if she knew anything about it. She said, "Oh yes." That was her. She hoped I did not mind. She had needed to get to the North Road quickly, and going through my property was a much shorter route than going around, and the gate was open, and it seemed fine. I want to note the specific phrasing of that last part. It seemed fine, not I assumed it was fine, not I thought it would be fine. It seemed fine, as though the question of whether it was actually fine was not something she had considered worth asking. I said I would rather she not drive through my garden, that the path was not designed for a vehicle, and that the tire pressure from the cart was compacting the soil in my beds. She said, oh, of course, she was sorry, she had not realized it was a problem. I said it was not a big deal, just wanted to mention it. She said she understood, and that it would not happen again. It happened again 2 weeks later. I knocked on her door this time. She was surprised to see me and then realized immediately why I was there and said she was sorry. She had been in a hurry and had not thought about it. She said she would be more careful. I said more careful was not quite what I was asking for. I said I was asking her not to drive through my property at all. She could use the community road to get to the North Road, which added about 4 minutes to her route. She said 4 minutes was actually quite inconvenient because she made that trip multiple times a day sometimes. I said I understood and that I was still asking her not to use my property as a shortcut. She said she would try to remember. Over the following 3 months, I found tire tracks in my garden on 6 separate occasions. 6. I knocked on her door twice more. Both times she apologized. Both times she said she would be more careful. Both times the tracks appeared again within 2 weeks. The 6th time I found tracks, the golf cart had gone through the section where I had just transplanted seedlings for the perennial border, and the tracks had destroyed 4 of them, not catastrophically, not the whole planting, but 4 plants I had grown from seed over the previous winter that were now flattened under the mark of a golf cart tire. I went home and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about what to do. The gate was the issue. The gate on the east side of my property, between my garden and Diane's property, was unlocked and unlatched, and Diane had clearly decided that an unlocked gate was an open invitation. The gate was there for my convenience. I used it occasionally to access the eastern side of the property from Diane's driveway when I had equipment deliveries, and I had not thought of it as a point of access that needed to be secured against a neighbor with a golf cart. I locked the gate. I put a padlock on it, a simple keyed padlock nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a lock on a gate on my own fence on my own property. 3 days later, the gate was open. Not unlocked, open. The padlock was on the ground next to the gate post, still locked, which meant the hasp it had been attached to had been pried off the gate. The gate was swinging open, and there were fresh tire tracks in my garden. I held the pried-off hasp in my hand and looked at it for a moment. Then I called my neighbor on the other side, a man named Ted who was level-headed and who had lived in Whispering Pines Estates for 15 years. I described what had happened. Ted was quiet for a moment and then said he had actually seen Diane's golf cart going through my garden earlier that day, but had assumed I had given her permission. I said I had not. He said he was sorry to hear that, and that what I had described, the pried hasp, was a genuine problem. I said yes, I thought so too. Ted said he thought I should talk to an attorney before doing anything else. He said the situation had moved past a neighborly disagreement. I agreed with him. I contacted an attorney named Patricia Helms who handled property and neighbor disputes and whom Ted had used for a boundary line issue several years earlier. I described the situation. Patricia said two things immediately. The first was that prying a lock off a gate on my property to gain access was criminal mischief at minimum and possibly breaking and entering in the civil sense, and that I should file a police report. The second was that I should document everything going forward, photographs of tracks, photographs of the gate, photographs of any damage, and that I should send Diane a formal written notice by certified mail informing her that she did not have permission to access my property in any manner, and that further unauthorized access would result in legal action. I filed the police report. The officer who took it was straightforward. He said he would document it and contact Diane, and that if she admitted to removing the lock, he would issue a formal warning. I do not know exactly what conversation the officer had with Diane. What I know is that she appeared on my porch the evening after the officer's visit, and that the conversation we had was the first in which she did not apologize. Instead, she said she felt I was being unreasonable and that the shortcut through my garden had been available for years before I moved in, which was interesting information that I filed away for future reference, and that I was disrupting something that the previous resident had been happy to accommodate. I said I was not the previous resident. She said she understood that but hoped I could see that cutting off access to a route she had relied on for years was a significant inconvenience. I said I understood it was an inconvenience and that I was still not going to allow golf cart traffic through my garden. She said she thought I was being unnecessarily rigid. I said I had sent her a certified notice through my attorney and that I expected her to comply with it. She left. She was not happy. The certified notice arrived at her address 3 days after our conversation. Return receipt signed. I filed the receipt. For 3 weeks after the certified notice, nothing happened. No tire tracks. The gate, which I had reattached with a heavier-duty hasp and a better padlock, remained intact. Then I found tracks again. Fresh ones, from a different direction this time, not through the gate, but through a section of the low field fence on the northeastern corner of my property where the fence was lower and where, I saw when I looked closely, boards had been removed to create a gap wide enough for a golf cart. Boards that had been in the fence had been removed and set against the fence post neatly, as though someone had done it carefully rather than hastily. Someone had thought about this. Someone had identified an alternative access point when the gate was blocked, had scouted the fence line, and had removed fence boards to create a new gap. This was not an impulsive decision. This was a plan. I photographed everything. I called Patricia. She said file another police report and that we were going to file for an injunction. I filed the second police report. The officer was the same one who had handled the first. He said the escalation from removing a padlock hasp to removing fence boards was significant and that he was going to treat it as a more serious matter this time. Patricia filed for an emergency injunction preventing Diane from accessing my property in any manner without my explicit written permission. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the 4 days between the filing and the hearing, I did something that I had been thinking about for weeks and that Patricia had told me I was entirely within my rights to do. I addressed the fence problem permanently. The low field fence on the northeastern corner, the section where Diane had removed boards, and the gate section on the eastern boundary were both, in their existing form, inadequate to prevent a determined person with tools and a golf cart from accessing my property. The field fence was old and low and not particularly robust. The gate, even with the heavy hasp and padlock, had been pried open once, and I did not trust that it was sufficient. I called a fencing contractor named Bill Ocaffer, who I had used 2 years earlier, to install a section of deer fencing around part of the orchard. Bill came and looked at the full eastern boundary of my property, all 180 feet of it where it abutted Diane's property, and I told him what I needed. I needed the entire boundary fenced in a way that would prevent vehicle access, that would be clear and visible and not aggressive in appearance, and that would be permanent. Bill said he could install a combination of 6-foot wooden privacy fence along the full boundary, with the gate section converted to a fixed panel matching the fence style, and that for the section near the road where vehicles had historically been the concern, he could include concrete wheel stops, low concrete barriers set in the ground on my side of the fence line. Set back just enough to be on my property and to provide a physical obstacle that would stop a golf cart or any other vehicle well before it reached the fence. I said that sounded exactly right. Bill scheduled the work for the following Thursday, the day after the injunction hearing. The injunction hearing was on a Wednesday. Patricia and I attended. Diane attended with an attorney of her own, a man named Gerald, who I had not previously encountered. Gerald argued that the injunction was disproportionate and that the access dispute was a neighborly matter that could be resolved without court intervention. Patricia presented the 2 police reports, the certified notice, the photographs of the tire tracks, the destroyed seedlings, the pried hasp, the removed fence boards, and the documented pattern of escalation. The judge granted the injunction. Diane's face, when the judge announced the decision, had the quality of a person who had genuinely believed, until that moment, that the court was going to see things her way. She had believed, I think, that what she was doing was so obviously reasonable in her own framework of the situation that a judge would recognize it as such. She had used that shortcut for years. The previous resident had allowed it. It was a minor thing, a golf cart, a garden, a few minutes. Why was everyone making such a fuss? The judge's ruling was not interested in her framework. The judge's ruling was interested in property rights, documented unauthorized access, and escalating conduct that had included removing a locked hasp and removing fence boards. The ruling was clear, and it was final for the duration of the proceedings. I drove home from the hearing and found Bill Ocaffer's crew arriving at my property for the fence installation. Bill's crew was efficient and experienced, and they worked in a way that showed they had done this kind of job many times. The privacy fence went up along the full 180 feet of the eastern boundary in 2 days. 6-foot cedar boards, good posts set in concrete, the gate section filled with a fixed cedar panel that matched the fence style exactly. On the inside of the fence, along the section nearest the road and nearest the former access points, Bill's crew installed 4 concrete wheel stops, low, solid, unobtrusive from a distance, but physically immovable, set at ground level on my side of the fence line. Each one was approximately 3 feet long, 10 inches wide, and 8 inches tall, set in its own concrete footing. A golf cart, or any vehicle, approaching from inside my property would have to go over them to reach the fence, which it could not do without high centering or significant damage to its undercarriage. The fence changed the character of the eastern side of my garden completely. Where there had been a low field fence through which everything was visible in both directions, there was now a 6-foot cedar wall that created, on my side, a genuine enclosed garden space. The privacy was something I had not anticipated valuing as much as I did, but standing in the garden on the day Bill's crew finished, looking at the fence line, I felt the particular pleasure of a space that has found its proper form. The garden had always been a place I cared about. Now it felt like a place that knew it was cared about. I thanked Bill and his crew. They left on Friday evening. I spent Saturday in the garden, tidying the sections nearest the fence, repairing the areas where the tire tracks from the golf cart had disturbed the soil and the mulch, checking the 4 seedlings that had been destroyed and determining which could be replaced, and which sections of the perennial border needed attention after the disruption of the previous weeks. The injunction required Diane to refrain from accessing my property. The fence, practically speaking, made the injunction physical rather than just legal. The two together, the court order and the cedar fence and the concrete wheel stops, created the kind of boundary that did not depend on Diane's cooperation or goodwill to remain effective. On Sunday afternoon, 2 days after the fence was completed, Diane came to the fence line and stood outside it. I was in the garden, and I saw her through the gap in the fence near the road where I had left a small access point for my own equipment use, a gap wide enough for my garden cart, closed with a simple wooden latch, not a vehicle access point. She was standing on her side of the fence looking at it. I watched her for a moment from the garden. Then I went back to what I was doing. She did not knock on my door that day. She knocked on my door the following Tuesday. I opened it. She said she wanted to talk. I said I was listening. She said she realized she had handled the situation badly. She said she should have asked my permission from the beginning instead of assuming it was fine. She said she was sorry about the padlock and the fence boards and that she understood those things had been wrong. She said she had not thought clearly about the fact that it was my property and that her convenience did not give her a right to access it. I want to be precise about how this felt, because it matters. It did not feel triumphant. It did not feel satisfying in the way that a victory over an adversary feels satisfying. It felt, more than anything, like relief, the specific relief of a conflict that has been running for an extended period, finally finding a point of resolution that feels genuine rather than negotiated. Diane was not apologizing because she had been forced to by a court order. She was apologizing because she had, apparently, over the 2 weeks since the injunction hearing, actually thought about what she had done and had arrived at a real understanding of it. I said I appreciated her saying that and that I accepted her apology. She asked if there was any possibility of an arrangement going forward. Not the golf cart, she said quickly. She understood the golf cart was not going to happen, but whether we could have a decent relationship as neighbors. I said yes, I thought we could, and that I had never had any wish for anything other than that. She said she was glad to hear it. We talked for another few minutes, not about the conflict, but about the garden. She said she had not realized, from her side of the old field fence, how extensive it was, and she asked what I was growing in the orchard. I told her. She said her late husband had kept apple trees and that she missed having fresh apples in the fall. I said I had 2 apple trees and that when they started producing reliably, I would bring her some. She said that would be lovely. She left. I watched her walk back to her property. The injunction proceedings concluded formally about 6 weeks later. Patricia filed the paperwork. Diane's attorney did not contest the conclusion. The case was closed. The legal costs were absorbed by both parties. Mine were not insignificant. I would rather not have spent that money. I would rather the situation had resolved at the first conversation, when I said, please do not drive through my garden, and she said I will not. It did not resolve then. It resolved where it resolved, which was at the fence line in my garden, 2 weeks after a judge told Diane clearly and officially what I had been telling her for months. The fence has been standing for 3 years now. The cedar has weathered to the particular silvery gray that cedar weathers to in outdoor exposure, which I have always found beautiful, not the raw orange yellow of new cedar, but the dignified gray of cedar that has been through seasons and settled into its place. The perennial border I have been developing along the inside of the fence has established well. I planted a series of shrub roses and ornamental grasses along the fence line the spring after it went in, and they have been growing into the space with the enthusiasm that plants show when they are well suited to their location. The roses are beginning to have the established, mature quality that takes several years to develop, and they make the fence more than just a boundary. They make it part of the garden's structure. The orchard trees have matured enough that this past fall I had my first meaningful apple harvest, not a large one, but real. I brought a bag of apples to Diane's door in October. She answered and saw the bag, and her face had the expression of someone receiving something they had half forgotten they had been promised. She thanked me and said they looked wonderful. I said I hoped she enjoyed them. We have had, in the 3 years since the fence went up, what I would describe as a careful but genuine neighborly relationship. We wave. We occasionally talk briefly at the mailboxes or the road. We do not have the easy warmth of people who have never had a conflict, because you do not get that back once you have lost it. What we have is something more deliberate than warmth, a mutual decision to treat each other decently because we are going to be neighbors for a long time, and because decent is achievable even when easy is not. The golf cart still exists. I see it occasionally in her driveway, clean and white and charged, the same vehicle that drove through my seedlings and through the section I had planted with months of work. She does not drive it on my property. The fence ensures this, but I think she would not do it even if the fence were not there, because I believe her apology was genuine, and because genuine understanding of a wrong does not usually require ongoing physical prevention to maintain. I posted the Reddit thread a year after the fence went in. The response was, as I said, larger than I expected. People recognized the structure of the situation, the entitled assumption, the escalation, the point at which a neighbor who has been reasonable has to become firm in a way that costs something. Several people asked in the comments whether I regretted not having addressed it more aggressively earlier. I said no, and I meant it. The sequence of responses I used, asking directly, asking again, locking the gate, filing police reports, getting an attorney, seeking an injunction, building the fence. Each one was a proportional response to what was happening at that stage, and each one created a record that made the eventual legal action clean and well documented. Escalating faster might have felt more satisfying in the moment and would probably have been messier in the outcome. Several people also asked, in various phrasings, what the lesson was. I said I thought there were two. The first was that an unlocked gate is not an invitation and should not need to be locked to communicate that it is not an invitation. But in practice, if you have a neighbor who has decided your property is their shortcut, the lock is necessary and should be installed before the pattern becomes established rather than after. The second was that a person who removes your lock to access your property has told you something important about how they understand the situation, and you should believe what they have told you and respond accordingly rather than hopping the next conversation will be the one that changes things. The concrete wheel stops are still in the ground on my side of the fence, invisible from outside because the fence is between them and Diane's property. They are unnecessary now in the practical sense. The fence is adequate, the injunction is concluded, Diane is not going to drive through my property. But I left them in the ground because removing them would require digging them out, and there is no reason to do that work. They are under the soil level except for the top surface, which I have covered with mulch so they do not look like an obstacle. They look, from inside the garden, like a slightly irregular feature of the ground. They are not irregular, they are exactly placed and exactly intentional and exactly right. The perennial border grows in front of them. The roses are going to be spectacular this summer. I can see it in the canes, the way they have extended, and the number of buds already forming in the early season growth. They are going to bloom against the silver-gray cedar fence in a way that I have been imagining since I planted them, and the imagining is going to turn out, I think, to have been accurate. Good gardens do that. They become what you planned for them to become if you are patient enough and if you protect the ground they grow in. The ground is protected. The garden grows. Thumbnail text. Line 1, my neighbor kept driving her golf cart through my garden after I said no, so I built a fence she'll never cross again. Line 2, then she pried my lock off and removed my fence boards, so I got a judge involved and it ended overnight face person.